The Bobcat realized a man was taking photos. What happened next was unexpected. George Thompson held his breath as a small bobcat cub emerged from behind the charred oak stump. Amber eyes locked on his weathered face. Finn, the youngest of three, sat perfectly still, mirroring the old photographer's posture with an uncanny precision that made George's heart skip. For 20 minutes they remained frozen in this silent communion. Two different species sharing the same profound understanding that sometimes the most important conversations happen without a single word being spoken. The Great Smoky Mountains bore the scars of devastation like an old soldier carrying invisible wounds. Last year's wildfire had swept through these ancient hills with merciless fury, reducing towering oaks and mountain laurels to skeletal remains that reached toward an indifferent sky. George had watched the news coverage from his cramped apartment in Gatlinburg, each aerial shot of the destruction cutting deeper into his already wounded soul. These mountains had been his sanctuary for 43 years, the place where he'd captured his most celebrated wildlife photographs, where he'd proposed to Margaret beneath blooming dogwoods, where he'd taught his son Eli to identify bird songs and read animal tracks on the soft forest floor. Now, at 72, with Margaret 3 years buried and Eli living his separate life in North Carolina, George had returned with nothing but his old camera and a stubborn thread of hope. He hadn't expected to find much, perhaps a few green shoots pushing through the ash, some small testament to nature's resilience that he could photograph as a symbol of renewal. What he discovered instead changed everything he thought he knew about loss, healing, and the mysterious ways that broken hearts can be made whole again. The Bobcat family had claimed the hollow interior of a massive fallen log as their den, a charred cathedral that had somehow survived the fire's worst fury. A mother and three cubs, living among the remnants of disaster as if nature herself were whispering, sometimes loss is necessary so that something beautiful can begin. George spotted them on his third morning in the forest, emerging from their unlikely sanctuary like ghosts materializing from ash and memory. Sasha, the mother, moved with the fluid grace of water flowing over stone. Her tawny coat bore subtle scars, testament to a life lived on the sharp edge between survival and death, but her golden eyes held an intelligence that made George catch his breath. She surveyed the burned landscape with the thoroughness of a general inspecting a battlefield, every sense alert to the possibilities of danger or opportunity that each moment might bring. The cubs followed in order of age and temperament. Rosie, the eldest, stayed close to her mother's flanks, already learning the cautious wisdom that would keep her alive in an unforgiving world. Her movements were deliberate and measured, each step calculated to avoid unnecessary risk. When Sasha paused to sniff the air or investigate a sound, Rosie mirrored her exactly, a devoted student absorbing lessons that could mean the difference between life and death. Scout, the middle cub, approached the world like it was his personal playground. He pounced on shadows, stalked invisible prey, and generally announced his presence to every creature within a quarter-mile radius. George watched with his heart in his throat as Scout ventured dangerously far from the safety of the den, chasing a red squirrel up a dead tree while a red-tailed hawk circled overhead. Only Sasha's sharp warning call brought him scrambling back to cover, the squirrel forgotten in the face of more immediate concerns. But it was Finn who captured George's attention completely. The youngest cub possessed a quality that set him apart from his siblings, a contemplative stillness that seemed almost human in its thoughtfulness. While Rosie practiced hunting techniques and Scout exhausted himself with boundless energy, Finn would position himself at the edge of their activities and simply watch. He observed his family, the recovering forest, and most intriguingly, George himself. George established his camp 300 meters from the Bobcat den, far enough to avoid disturbing their daily routines, but close enough to document their remarkable story of adaptation and survival. He pitched his modest tent in a small clearing, surrounded by the ghosts of what had once been a thriving grove of mountain laurel, their charred skeletons now serving as sentinels watching over his temporary home. Each morning, he would settle against the same boulder, a massive piece of granite that had somehow emerged unscathed from the fire's fury, camera ready but unobtrusive, prepared to wait hours for a single meaningful photograph. The boulder became his anchor, his meditation cushion, His classroom desk, where he learned lessons no university had ever taught, its surface, warmed by the morning sun and cooled by evening shadows, became as familiar to him as his own skin. He mapped every crevice, every lichen patch, every subtle variation in its weathered surface. Margaret used to tease him about his patience, claiming he could outweight a stone if it might eventually do something interesting. "You don't photograph animals, George," she would say with that gentle smile that still visited his dreams. "You photograph souls." The irony wasn't lost on him now. Here he was, literally waiting alongside a stone. And it was indeed doing something interesting. It was teaching him stillness, grounding him to this place, serving as a bridge between his human restlessness and the patient rhythms of the natural world. As the days passed, George began to notice Finn's unusual behavior. The young cub would emerge from the den each morning and take up a position that offered him a clearer view of George's location. At first, George assumed this was simple curiosity or perhaps wariness. But gradually, he realized something extraordinary was happening. Finn was studying him, learning from him, mimicking his techniques of patient observation. When George shifted his position to get a better angle, Finn would adjust his posture accordingly. When George tilted his head to track a bird's flight, Finn would tilt his head in the same direction. Most remarkably, when George settled into the profound stillness that 40 years of wildlife photography had taught him, Finn would become equally motionless, demonstrating a capacity for sustained attention that seemed impossible in such a young creature. George began to see himself reflected in each of the cubs, recognizing different stages of his own life journey in their distinct personalities. Rosie embodied the careful caution of his early career. When every assignment felt like a test he might fail, when he'd second-guess every camera setting and agonize over each composition. He remembered those early years when he'd carry multiple backup cameras, terrified that equipment failure might cost him the shot that could make or break his reputation. Scout reminded him of his younger, more reckless years, when he'd taken dangerous risks for the perfect shot, climbing precarious cliffs in Alaska to photograph nesting eagles, wading into crocodile-infested waters in the Everglades, or tracking wolves through Yellowstone's backcountry during blizzards that should have killed him a dozen times over. Those had been the years when Margaret would pace the floor during his extended assignments, when she'd made him promise to call every evening, when she'd learned to read the weather reports for whatever remote location he'd disappeared into. "You photograph like you're trying to prove something," she'd told him once. And she'd been right. He'd been trying to prove he belonged in the company of the great nature photographers, that a kid from Tennessee could compete with legends who seemed born with cameras in their hands. But Fin represented who he had become in the aftermath of loss, someone seeking meaning in small moments, learning to find profound significance in the simple act of bearing witness. Someone who had discovered that the most powerful photographs often came not from death-defying adventures, but from the patient cultivation of trust and understanding. The realization struck him one morning as he watched Finn practice the art of stillness. George was not just documenting these creatures' recovery from the fire's devastation, he was recovering alongside them. The forest, which had felt empty and lifeless when he first arrived, was slowly revealing itself to be full of quiet conversations, subtle communications, and a deep sense of presence that filled the hollow spaces in his grieving heart. His relationship with Sasha began with an accident that became a blessing. During his second week of observation, George accidentally dropped his red scarf while adjusting his camera equipment. The scarf had been Margaret's last Christmas gift to him, a simple woolen square she'd claimed would keep him warm during his outdoor photography sessions. He'd worn it on every shoot since her death, a talisman of love and memory. George didn't immediately notice the scarf's absence. Only when he returned to camp that evening did he realize it was missing. He spent the better part of an hour searching the area around his boulder, increasingly desperate at the thought of losing this precious connection to his late wife. Finally, he gave up, telling himself that perhaps it was time to let go of such attachments. 3 days later, as he photographed the cub's morning play session, George noticed something that made his heart stop. There, woven into the entrance of the Bobcat den, was a flash of familiar red wool, Sasha had found his scarf and incorporated it into her family's nest, using Margaret's gift as bedding for her cubs. The sight overwhelmed George with emotions he couldn't name: gratitude, wonder, and a profound sense that something sacred had just occurred. In that moment, George understood that his relationship with this family had transformed from mere observation to genuine connection. Nature wasn't simply tolerating his presence, it was accepting him, welcoming him into its circle of life and death and renewal. The red scarf became a bridge between his human world of memory and loss and the wild world of immediate presence and survival. The test of this connection came 3 weeks into his residency. When George discovered that Sasha was in trouble, he'd noticed her favoring her left front paw, moving with a subtle stiffness that spoke of pain carefully hidden from her cubs. At first, he'd attributed it to the normal wear and tear of life in the wild, perhaps a twisted ankle from navigating the treacherous terrain of fallen logs and hidden debris. But as days passed, the limp became more pronounced, and George began to see the larger implications. An injured mother meant reduced hunting success, which meant less food for growing cubs, which could mean the difference between survival and starvation as winter approached. Following her tracks early one morning, moving with the stealth that 40 years of wildlife photography had taught him, George found the source of her injury: an old leg-hold trap, partially concealed beneath fallen leaves and debris. The discovery hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him momentarily dizzy with rage and sorrow. The trap was illegal. Trapping season had ended months earlier and appeared to have been abandoned by whoever had set it. Rust stained the metal jaws, and caught in the mechanism was a tuft of tawny fur that could only have come from Sasha. The sight filled George with a rage so pure it left him shaking. This was not nature being cruel. This was human carelessness, creating ongoing suffering for innocent creatures. For 40 years, George had maintained strict ethical boundaries in his wildlife photography. He observed, he documented, but he never interfered. The natural world was harsh and arbitrary and beautiful and terrible, and his role was to witness it all without judgment or intervention. But this trap was not part of the natural order. It was a human intrusion that had no place in the wild world he'd come to love. That night, George wrestled with the most difficult decision of his professional life. Every instinct told him to maintain his objectivity, to document Sasha's struggle without interfering in the outcome. But his heart told him something different. This was not just any wild creature. This was Sasha, the mother whose grace and courage he'd been privileged to witness, whose cubs had become as familiar to him as his own family. In the pre-dawn darkness, George made his choice, moving through the forest with the stealth that decades of wildlife photography had taught him. He found the trap and carefully disabled it. The metal was corroded and ancient, clearly forgotten by whoever had placed it there. He carried it back to his camp and buried it beneath a pile of stones, ensuring it could never again cause harm to any living creature. But removing the trap was only half the solution. Sasha was injured and struggling to hunt effectively for her growing family. That evening, George violated another sacred principle of wildlife observation. He approached the bobcat den more closely than he'd ever dared and left a gift: a piece of fresh venison he'd purchased in town, already cooked and cooled, easy for an injured predator to consume without expending precious energy on a hunt. That piece of venison was supposed to be his own meal, but he knew Sasha needed that protein more than he did, because she had her cubs to take care of. Then he retreated to his camp and waited, consumed by doubt and second-guessing. "I've broken the rules," he whispered to the darkness, feeling like he'd crossed a line from which there might be no return. The next morning brought vindication. The meat was gone, and Sasha emerged from the den moving with noticeably less pain. More significantly, when she spotted George at his usual observation post, she didn't retreat or show alarm. Instead, she held his gaze for a long moment, and in her golden eyes, George saw something that made his breath catch: recognition, understanding, and perhaps even gratitude. "Let me heal the wounds inflicted by humanity's selfishness," George said softly, with the kindness of a human heart. From that day forward, the relationship between George and the Bobcat family evolved in ways that defied every principle of wildlife observation he had ever learned. The cubs, perhaps sensing their mother's acceptance of the strange human presence, began to interact with him more directly. Scout, ever the explorer, started treating George as a landscape feature to be investigated. One morning, the adventurous cub stalked George with all the seriousness of a predator approaching prey, creeping from rock to rock until he finally pounced on the photographer's camera bag. The attack resulted in a thorough inspection of George's equipment, with Scout batting around a lens cap like a hockey puck and shredding a packet of lens-cleaning tissues with focused determination. George held perfectly still throughout the encounter, afraid that any movement might break the spell of this unprecedented interaction between human and wild creature. Rosie's interactions were more subtle but equally meaningful. The eldest cub began including George in her visual surveys of the territory, acknowledging his presence with brief nods that seemed to classify him as a benign part of their landscape. Once, distracted by a butterfly, she wandered closer to George's position than she'd ever ventured before, close enough that he could see the individual whiskers on her face before she realized her mistake and bounded back to safety. But it was Finn who provided the most profound exchanges. The contemplative cub had graduated from simply mimicking George's observational techniques to actively participating in them. Each morning, Finn would position himself on his chosen perch and join George in watching the forest wake up around them. Together, they witnessed the gradual return of life to the burned landscape, insects colonizing new growth, birds claiming territory and recovering trees, small mammals venturing out from hidden refuges. The morning that Finn brought George his first gift marked a turning point in their relationship. George had been photographing a ruby-throated hummingbird feeding on fire-adapted wildflowers when a small object dropped into his lap. It was his lens cap, the one that Scout had appropriated and carried off several days earlier. But now it bore the unmistakable signs of having been buried and carefully exhumed, clean enough to be recognizable but marked with the scent of wild places. George looked up to find Finn sitting just a few feet away, watching his reaction with those amber eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young creature. The message was clear. This was an exchange, a trade, a recognition that their relationship involved reciprocity. George reached into his camera bag and withdrew a handful of walnuts he'd been carrying as trail snacks. He placed them on the ground between himself and Finn, then retreated to his usual position. The young bobcat approached the offering with careful attention, sniffing thoroughly before picking up one of the nuts and carrying it back toward the den. The sight of a wild bobcat returning equipment to an old photographer struck George as so absurdly wonderful that he laughed out loud the first time he'd experienced genuine joy since Margaret's death. He managed to capture the moment on film, creating what would become his favorite image from the entire residency. Finn walking away with his walnut prize, head held high with unmistakable satisfaction. These daily interactions became a source of vitality that George hadn't known he was missing. Scout continued his campaign of playful harassment, using the dry leaves scattered around George's position to stage elaborate ambush scenarios. The mischievous cub would rustle through the debris, creating sounds designed to make George think a larger predator was approaching. One morning, George decided to turn the tables, hiding behind a tree and making his own rustling sounds when Scout approached. The result was mutually startling, both photographer and bobcat jumping backward and landing in undignified heaps on the forest floor. The moment of shared surprise dissolved into what George could only describe as laughter, though he wasn't sure if bobcats were actually capable of such expressions. Scout bounded away with unmistakable delight, and George found himself grinning like a schoolboy who just pulled off the perfect prank. These fleeting moments of pure joy became medicine for a spirit George had thought permanently damaged by grief. Margaret had always said that laughter was the best gauge of his emotional health, and her absence had left his world almost entirely without humor. Now, surrounded by the antics of 3 bobcat cubs, George felt parts of himself reawakening that he'd feared were lost forever. The photograph that would define his entire residency came unexpectedly. During what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, George had been packing his equipment, preparing to return to camp for the evening, when he noticed Finn in a pose that stopped him cold. The young bobcat was sitting perfectly still, but instead of watching the forest or his family, his gaze was directed straight into George's camera lens, This was not the casual glance that wild animals sometimes give photographers the momentary acknowledgement before they return to more important business. This was a deliberate pose, a conscious decision to be photographed, to participate in the act of image making. More than that, there was something in Finn's expression that reminded George so powerfully of his son Eli that he felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't a physical resemblance. There was obviously nothing human about the young bobcat's features, but something deeper. Something in the quality of attention, the openness to experience, the fearless curiosity about the world that George remembered from Eli's childhood. Before life had taught his son to be careful, guarded, professionally distant. George raised his camera with hands that trembled slightly and captured what would become the centerpiece of his final collection. When he developed the image weeks later, he stared at it for a long time, seeing not just a beautiful portrait of a wild animal, but a mirror that reflected something essential about consciousness, awareness, and the connections that exist between all living things. That night, sitting by his small campfire, George wrote the first letter he'd sent to his son in over a year. It wasn't long, wasn't filled with recriminations or apologies or explanations for the distance that had grown between them since Margaret's death. It contained only a few lines and a promise that he would send a photograph soon. "I've been learning about patience from a teacher who has never spoken a word," he wrote. "I think you would understand him. He reminds me of you when you were young, before the world convinced you that you had to choose between wildness and wisdom. I hope you'll come see what I've discovered here." He printed Finn's photograph and sent it with a simple note. "You're not so different from these strong, tender creatures." Eli's response came faster than George had dared hope. Just 2 weeks later, a familiar rental car pulled into the forest access road, and his son emerged carrying a backpack and wearing an expression George recognized from childhood, cautious hope mixed with determined resolve. They stood facing each other across 3 years of accumulated grief and misunderstanding. Two men who had loved the same woman and lost her in different ways, who had retreated into separate versions of sorrow that left little room for each other's pain. "Dad," Eli said simply. "Son," George replied. That evening, George led Eli to his observation post and shared the routine that had become as natural to him as breathing. They sat in comfortable silence as the Bobcat family emerged for their evening activities, and George watched his son's face transform as he witnessed the miracle that had been healing George's heart for months. Eli brought a different perspective to the observation, where George saw individual personalities and behaviors. Eli, trained in conservation biology, read the larger ecological story being told in this recovering landscape. But both men recognized the same fundamental truth that George had been learning from Finn, that the deepest understanding comes not from analyzing or categorizing, but from simply being present, from allowing oneself to witness without the immediate need to interpret or judge. They watched Sasha demonstrate hunting techniques to her cubs, her injury now completely healed, her movements fluid and powerful. They observed Scout's continued adventures, his fearless exploration of every corner of his expanding world. They saw Rosie practicing the skills that would soon allow her to survive independently, her caution evolving into confidence. And they watched Finn, now grown into a young adult, but still possessing that quality of contemplative awareness that had first drawn George's attention. The young bobcat acknowledged their presence with a brief glance, then returned to his own observation of the forest around them. "Jesus, Dad," Eli whispered after they'd been sitting in silence for over an hour. "How did you find this place?" George considered the question, thinking of all the losses and wrong turns and acts of desperation that had brought him to this burned forest, to this family of wild creatures who had taught him how to live again. "I think it found me, Tuan," he said finally. They stayed together for a week, father and son learning to communicate again through the shared language of wonder and careful attention. Eli helped George organize the hundreds of photographs he'd taken, selecting the images that best told the story of renewal and resilience playing out in this recovering landscape. More importantly, they began to repair the relationship that had been damaged by grief and the different ways men sometimes process overwhelming loss. George learned that Eli's distance hadn't been rejection, but protection, an attempt to shield his father from additional worry when sorrow had already consumed both their lives. Eli learned that his father's withdrawal hadn't been indifference but a necessary hibernation, a retreat that had allowed him to find his way back to the world of the living. On Eli's last morning, they sat together at George's observation post and watched the Bobcat family begin another day. Father and son understood without speaking that they were witnessing the end of something precious, not just Eli's visit, but George's time with these remarkable teachers who had shown him how to heal. "He's saying goodbye," Eli said softly as Finn emerged from the den and looked directly at them both. George nodded, understanding that his son was right, that somehow the young Bobcat sensed the approaching change. "Not goodbye," George corrected gently. "Thank you." At summer's end, George made the difficult decision to leave the forest. The cubs were approaching independence. Sasha was preparing for the winter challenges ahead, and George knew that his presence, no matter how carefully managed, remained an intrusion into their wild world. But he didn't leave empty-handed. Beyond the hundreds of photographs documenting their remarkable story, he carried a renewed sense of purpose and understanding of his place in the world that had been missing since Margaret's death. Before departing, George constructed what he called Sasha Point, a small observation blind built from local materials, designed to blend seamlessly into the recovering forest. It wasn't intended as a tourist attraction, but as a resource for serious students of wildlife behavior. Researchers who shared his commitment to observation without interference. He left detailed notes about the behavioral patterns he'd observed, ethical guidelines for anyone using the facility, and strict instructions that the blind should never be occupied for more than a few hours at a time, should remain closed during breeding season, and must serve the continued well-being of the wildlife it was designed to help people observe. The last photo book of George Thompson's career was published the following spring. The Quiet Ones became both a commercial success and a cultural phenomenon, praised by critics and conservationists for its unique perspective on wildlife recovery and the bonds that can form between human and animal consciousness. In the book's foreword, George wrote, "It's not always those who make noise who tell the story. Sometimes, the quietest ones teach us the greatest lessons." This book is dedicated to all the quiet ones, the creatures who teach by example, who heal with their presence, who remind us that the deepest wisdom is often found not in doing, but in simply being. The book's success brought numerous opportunities, but George found he was no longer driven by the recognition that had motivated his earlier career. Instead, he spent his time teaching, working with university programs, mentoring young photographers, consulting with conservation organizations. Most importantly, he served as a guide for a new generation of wildlife observers, teaching them not just technical skills, but the ethical framework that should govern all human interaction with the natural world. When Eli graduated with his master's degree in conservation biology, he was invited to speak at the commencement ceremony. His speech contained no charts, no statistics, no technical jargon. Instead, he told a simple story about a father who taught me how to look at nature and a family of bobcats who taught him how to live again. The hall fell utterly silent, then erupted in sustained applause. In the audience, George wiped tears from his eyes, understanding that his son had learned the most important lesson of all, that the most profound truths are often the simplest ones, and that healing comes not from complex theories, but from patient attention to the world around us. Years passed. George grew older, his hands less steady, his legs less strong, but his capacity for wonder remained undimmed. He made occasional pilgrimages back to the Great Smoky Mountains, always stopping at Sasha Point to sit quietly in the blind he'd built and witness the ongoing recovery of the forest he'd come to love. On his final visit, at age 81, George spent a week in the small cabin that the Park Service had constructed for visiting researchers. Each morning, he made his way to the observation blind and settled into the familiar rhythm of watching and waiting. The forest had recovered completely from the fire that had originally brought him to this place, the canopy once again forming a green cathedral that filtered sunlight into golden rays. That last morning George spent in the wilderness. As he sat watching the sun rise through the recovering trees, he heard a sound that made his heart leap with recognition. It was a bobcat's call, not alarm or aggression, but the gentle vocalization that meant safety, home, family. He never saw the caller, but George chose to believe that somewhere in that sound was acknowledgement, a final gift from the wild creatures who had taught him life's most important lesson. One autumn afternoon, 3 months after returning from his final mountain pilgrimage, George sat on the wooden porch of his small house, hearing a faint sound from deep within his memory. Not a growl, but a soft call that seemed to carry his name on the wind. He smiled and looked up at the golden sky, feeling the presence of all his teachers, Margaret, Finn, Sasha, and the countless quiet ones who had shown him that healing comes not from forgetting our losses, but from remaining open to unexpected connections. "I don't take pictures anymore," he murmured to the gathering dusk, "but I still remember you all so well." George Thompson died peacefully in his sleep that winter, surrounded by the photographs that had defined his life's work. His memorial service was attended by hundreds of students he'd mentored, conservationists he'd inspired, photographers who had learned from his example. But perhaps the most fitting tribute was this simple plaque that Eli installed at Sasha Point, containing only his father's name, dates, and a single line from the quiet ones. Sometimes the quietest ones have the most important things to say. The observation blind continues to serve its purpose, hosting researchers and students who come to learn the art of patient attention that George Thompson spent his final years teaching. And sometimes, in the early morning mist or the golden light of evening, visitors report hearing soft calls from deep within the forest, sounds that might be bobcats communicating with their families, or might be something more mysterious, the ongoing conversation between all the quiet ones who understand that the most profound lessons are taught not through words, but through the simple, sacred act of bearing witness to the wonder of being alive.